The caller was screaming, but Daniel did not blink. He kept his gaze locked on the glowing cursor blinking rhythmically against the dark screen. The plastic headset dug into his skin, a constant, dull pressure he had learned to ignore. He watched the timer tick upward. 3 minutes. 4. He waited for the shouting to subside, his fingers hovering inches above the mute button. He did not snap back. He did not sigh. He simply repeated the company script, his tone leveled to a flat, unyielding hum until the line finally went dead. He clicked the ready button. Silence returned to the cubicle for exactly 3 seconds before the next call surged through the line. This was his 10th hour today. His paycheck arrived every 2 weeks, yet it barely covered the rent for his cramped apartment. He looked across the office floor. His colleagues were slumped in their chairs, voices rising in a chorus of complaints about management. Daniel looked away. He kept his focus on the terminal, his posture rigid, his breathing rhythmic. He accepted the next call, his voice soft and steady, ready to endure the cycle all over again. The office lights flickered as the shift ended, but Daniel stayed in his chair until the room thinned out. His coworkers huddled near the break room, voices loud and sharp as they traded grievances about the management. Daniel did not join them. He pulled a small, worn notebook from his bag. He opened to a fresh page, the paper crisp against his calloused fingertips. He wrote down the exact amount he had earned that day, the ink dark and permanent. He subtracted a fixed percentage, drawing a clean line beneath the remaining total. This was his private ledger, a document of his own making. He stood up, ignored the chatter of his peers, and walked to the bank. It was a 20-minute trek through the cold, but he walked with a steady pace. He deposited the small sum into a brokerage account. He bought shares of low-cost index funds. The teller watched him, her brow furrowed, and asked why he bothered with such a tiny amount. Daniel looked at the receipt, tucked it into his pocket, and replied, "It is not about the amount today. It is about the habit." He walked back into the night, the weight of his small, growing investment firmer in his mind than the exhaustion in his legs. Years drifted by, in a blur of ringing phones and flickering screens. The call center relocated twice, shedding its old plastic desks for sleek, ergonomic stations that hummed with new technology. Daniel remained in his seat, the only constant in a sea of turnover. He stopped seeing the calls as burdens and started viewing them as puzzles. He mastered the art of the pause, the rhythm of negotiation, and the steady anchor of patience. When others grew frantic, Daniel grew calm. His metrics soared. He became the top performer not by rushing, but by de-escalating the most volatile conflicts with surgical precision. Promotions followed, each accompanied by a significant raise. His colleagues celebrated these milestones with dinners and new possessions, but Daniel stayed the course. He walked into his office on the day of his 3rd promotion, signed the paperwork, and opened his banking terminal. The extra funds vanished into his portfolio before he even left the parking lot. He lived in the same apartment, drove the same sedan, and navigated the same daily commute. His lifestyle remained static, a silent, disciplined contrast to the rising numbers on his screen. He was building a machine, one paycheck at a time, indifferent to the pace of the world around him. The office floor transformed as the years settled. Colleagues arrived with fresh sets of keys, bragging about high-interest car loans and the latest electronics that promised convenience but delivered debt. They spent their lunch hours debating brands, comparing features, and showing off photos of luxury items purchased on credit. Daniel watched the cycle repeat. He walked to the parking lot where his own sedan sat, the paint fading, the engine reliable. He climbed inside, turned the key, and heard the familiar, steady rattle that meant he owed nothing to anyone. Back in his apartment, the walls remained bare, the furniture basic, and the rent predictable. He avoided the trap of lifestyle inflation with surgical precision. Every raise from the company was not a signal to upgrade his life, but a signal to increase his contributions. While others felt the pressure to project success through material displays, Daniel found clarity in the silence of his bank balance. He chose the slow, grinding path of index fund accumulation. He understood that every dollar spent on a depreciating asset was a dollar stolen from his eventual freedom. He kept his head down, focused on the math of the long game, and watched the market charts with the patience of a man who knew exactly what he was building. Lunch hour became a private theater. While his coworkers crowded the break room to discuss the latest office rumors, Daniel retreated to his terminal. He pulled up his brokerage portal, the screen light reflecting in his eyes. The white noise of the office faded as he tracked the movement of the indices. He watched the red and green bars flicker, a rhythmic pulse that matched his own intent. He didn't just read the numbers, he mapped the trends, noting the subtle shifts in volume and velocity that others ignored. He saw the market begin to stretch, the tension in the charts tightening like a wire pulled to the brink of snapping. He tapped his finger against the desk, counting the intervals. The data suggested a major correction was imminent, a shift that would define the success of his decade-long accumulation. He felt the momentum building, a quiet vibration in the numbers that promised a turning point. He closed the window, stood up, and walked back to his headset. He wasn't just working a shift anymore. He was waiting for the exact moment when the math of his life would finally align with the volatility of the world. The balance was close. He could feel it in the steady climb of the indices, a silent signal that the long wait was nearing its final hour. Tuesday morning arrived with a violent shift in the market. The indices opened with erratic, sharp movements, jumping in increments that defied the week's previous trends. Daniel kept his headset on, handling calls with mechanical precision, but his focus had split. During the 10-minute break, he stood up, bypassed the break room, and walked straight to the parking lot. The air outside was cold, biting against his skin. He stopped beside his old sedan and pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen glowed in the gray daylight. He tapped the brokerage app icon. The loading bar moved, then the dashboard refreshed. The numbers blinked, scrolling through the current value of every share he had accumulated over the last decade. He stopped breathing. The total hit the screen, 7 digits staring back at him in bold black font. He held the phone steady, his thumb hovering over the glass. There was no sound, only the distant hum of traffic on the highway. He checked the math twice, 3 times, comparing the balance to his mental ledger. The surge had pushed him over the threshold. He stood in the quiet of the lot, the phone light casting a sharp reflection on his palm, and watched as the market ticker continued to update, rising higher with every passing second. The weight that had sat on his shoulders for a decade simply evaporated. It was a physical sensation, as if a heavy pack had been unbuckled and dropped into the asphalt. Daniel let out a breath he had been holding since his first day at this job. He looked at his hands. They were not shaking. The frantic need to check the math, the constant tallying of rent versus savings, the precise calculations of every dollar, all of it vanished. He stood in the parking lot and watched the clouds move over the building. For the first time, the future was not a series of bills to be paid. It was a blank space. He closed the app and slid the phone into his pocket. He wiped his palms on his trousers and took a long, slow step toward the entrance. His heart rate, usually spiked by the prospect of another call, remained steady. He walked past the rows of cars, his gait relaxed. He did not look back at the sedan. He approached the automatic glass doors and pushed them open. The air inside smelled of dust and recycled electricity. He walked across the lobby, his boots clicking against the linoleum, and stepped onto the elevator. The floor indicator climbed. He was going back to the desk, but for the first time, he was not trapped. Daniel pulled his chair out and sat down. The plastic headset rested on the desk, coiled like a serpent against the gray surface. He looked at it. For years, this object had been the primary source of his tension, the physical boundary that kept him tethered to the cubicle. He reached out and touched the foam padding. The material was worn, flattened by thousands of hours of use. He picked it up and turned it over in his hands, feeling the weight of the wire. It was no longer a shackle. As he adjusted the band, the realization solidified into a singular, cold fact. This device had funded every share, every index fund, and every step toward his independence. It was the machine that had built his exit strategy. He placed the headset on the desk again, observing the way the light caught the plastic. It was a tool, nothing more. He felt the cold air from the overhead vent against his skin and watched his coworkers walk by, oblivious to the change in his posture. He leaned back, his spine straight against the chair, and observed the room. The cubicle walls did not feel like they were closing in anymore. They were merely the frame for his final act of work, a choice he was making, not a condition he was forced to endure. Daniel pulled the headset over his ears. He clicked the button to accept the next incoming line. A voice erupted from the earpiece, sharp and jagged with frustration. The caller was demanding a refund for a complex error that had been pending for weeks. Daniel did not reach for the mute button. He listened to the shouting, his fingers resting lightly on the keyboard. He waited for the silence that always followed a tirade. When it came, he spoke. His voice was level, measured, and devoid of the defensive edge he had once carried. He outlined the solution, step by step, citing the technical codes and company protocols he had memorized over the years. The caller interrupted, but Daniel simply paused, waited, and resumed his explanation without changing his tone. He navigated the system with surgical efficiency, pulling up files and verifying transactions in seconds. The caller's voice dropped, replaced by confusion and then grudging acceptance as the problem resolved. Daniel confirmed the final update, said the standard closing phrase, and disconnected. He remained seated, staring at the blank screen for a heartbeat. The silence in the room felt different now. He was here because he chose to be, and for the first time, he was entirely in control of the exchange. Daniel clicked the log-off button. The screen flickered and went dark, the cursor vanishing into the black monitor. He stood up, pushed his chair under the desk, and left the headset resting exactly where he had placed it. He walked down the rows of cubicles, his footsteps echoing against the thin carpet. Coworkers were still hunched over their phones, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of their own terminals. He did not look back. He reached the glass doors, pushed them open, and stepped into the cool evening air. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for his own sedan. He walked to the driver's side door, unlocked it, and slid into the seat. He turned the key. The engine caught on the first attempt, a steady, rhythmic vibration under his hands. He shifted into gear and pulled out of the space. As he turned onto the main road, he glanced at the dashboard clock. The numbers changed, but for the first time in his life, they held no weight. He pressed the accelerator, left the office complex behind, and merged into the flow of traffic. The road ahead was clear. He was heading home, and tomorrow, the clock would have no claim on his time.